Right. Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session 8 of our research symposium. In this session, I think many of you are very, very interested to learn more about Korean popular media. As someone who enjoys East Asian music and who may or may not have a playlist filled with Blackpink, BTS, New Jeans. Ano yung answer New Jeans? Sige nyo sa akin later. I'm especially looking forward to this session. Good afternoon, I'm Marcia Murillo, all the way from Ateneo de Naga University, from Bicol. Ang saya ng politics namin doon. Yes. If you want to know more about millennials, controversy later. Today, right now, let's focus on our presentations this afternoon. Today, we'll explore the intersections of pop culture, civic life, and cultural critique through the lens of Korean popular media. Our panel of papers, if you've read the books of abstracts, they attempt to examine how K-pop and Korean visual narratives are not just sources of entertainment, but rich and complex spaces of social meaning, activism, and cultural expression. So I invite you again to listen to the presentations, and please jot down your questions or comments later. And now, I will not anymore talk here. Our first paper, entitled From Stands to Active Citizens, Spaces and Motivations for Civic Re-engagement in K-pop fandoms in the Philippines, will be presented by our friends from West Visayas State University, Giselle Marie Aranas, Ian Marie Espanola, and Sarah Margaret Gabriel.
Hello, good afternoon. Is this okay? Okay, audible? Well, online na. So good afternoon to all. My name is Joseph Marie Aranas from West Visayas University from the College of Communication, all the way from UAE City. So I'm a development communication instructor. This research inquiry actually started with two of my students here with today, Marie S. Espanola and Sarah Margaret G. Gabriel actually told me, ma'am, we really want to do a research on K-pop. Regarding on what exactly, I guess that was up to me. So why they choose me, I don't know. Maybe I'm one of the 5% faculty in the college who is actually a K-pop fan. So here we are. So I would like to thank, here we are trying to delve into the intersection of K-pop and development communication. So with that, I would like to thank the UP Korean Research Center for allowing us to present this passion project. Okay, so civic engagement and apathy among younger generation has actually been a topic of scrutiny and concern for the past years, which makes sense. As young people today are expected to become future thought leaders, decision makers, so having a apathetic and non-participative youth sector may actually be a threat to the future of our nation. So by usual standards of what civic engagements are and its criteria, today's youth with no memberships, no participation to any formal institutions may not be actually considered as citizens. But young people see a problem with the formal civic engagements. Yes? Yes? They feel excluded, unwelcome, have no sense of belongingness in the type and forms of practices established in the generations before them. So in theory and statistics, sure, there's a decline, but on the grounds, scholars see that young people are actually active in politics, in the community, and mga ganaps outside academic institutions. So with this development, scholars have proposed to move the metrics for youth civic engagement. So we could redefine it as the youth ranging from late millennials and early Gen Z be developing a new form of citizenship. So interestingly, one that is quite novel in such a niche, where young people find opportunities to lend a hand to their neighbors and practice civic action is actually through fandoms. So it becomes a novel approach to youth civic engagement. Fandoms are often associated with many negative values in our youth, absent-mindedness, consumption, but looking into it much deeper, their experiences are actually very different. So fandoms and interest-based can create activities that can make our young people active citizens in the country, so they can actually be active citizens. So as development communicators, we are always looking for spaces where we can encourage young people to participate in civic action, so we ask this question. How did supporting a for-profit business like K-pop lead to the youth's active participation in the community? And we also, one of our objectives, as you can see, Jen put that on PowerPoint in memes, is to describe the type and level of community engagement, map the spaces occupied by youth fandoms with the civic engagement continuing movement, to define their motivation in conducting civic initiatives. So to map the civic engagement spaces covered by Filipino BTS armies in the community, the study utilized the dimensions and continuum of civic engagement by Adler and Logan in 2005, and we also used the assumptions and concepts of Johnson & Johnson's 2008 Social Interdependence Theory, which was inspired by Deutsch's 1949 Theory of Cooperation Competition to guide our analysis for fandom attribution. So, for example, it's a qualitative descriptive study, gathering public accessible online posts and applying inclusion criteria. So we come up with 22 samples. So we did deductive analysis to map civic engagement spaces based on the existing categories by Adler and Logan in 2005. So civic engagement can actually be mapped using two factors: charity, volunteerism, activism, and social change. And of course, we did, for the motivation, we applied thematic analysis by Clark and Brown. So my students, Lian and Marvel, both fans of BTS, will be presenting the results of the research.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. So, for the results and the discussion of our study, we were able to collect a total of 22 civic initiatives conducted by Filipino BTS armies. And most of it falls under the category of nature, whereas disaster reliefs, environmental advocacies, and mental health awareness, educational support, general donations, and fundraisings are almost found. And also, we have next the schedule. Most of the heavy activities initiated by the Filipino BTS armies happens most likely on the third and fourth quarter of the year. Third quarter of the year known to be the months where most typhoons enter Philippines, and the fourth quarter of the year is known to be the holiday season, where the holiday season begins. And lastly, we have organizer or organizing mechanisms. Some fandoms have actually the free will to independently organize their very own events. And it is also important to take note that there were no signs of bureaucracies found in the study. And next, please. Okay, so we have for the level of fandom-driven civic engagement, we have 4. So charity, holding the top spot. Please next, ma'am. Thank you. So we have charity holding the top spot with a total of 10 initiatives categorized under it. This is where the fandom plays their active citizenship, especially during disasters, where immediate humanitarian needs like food supplies, clothes, medicines are the top priority. So activities under this category can be facilitated through online donation platforms and mechanisms. So 2 of the examples of charity events they have conducted is the Support Farmers Help Gypsy Drivers, and also the December with Love, a fundraising event. Okay, next we have volunteerism. So volunteerism, holding a total of 5 initiatives categorized under it, serves as a mechanism to execute the aid gathered from their charity activities. So there is a certain overlap between charity and volunteerism that shows the valuable integration of how they mobilize the resources and their participants, which is active participation. And then we have fandoms provide multimodal areas for civic engagements, monetary or service. So let me explain that. You can either opt for monetary donations for the projects, or if you do not have the means for the monetary donation, you can opt for service. So there is a choice where you can give your service to or help to others. And next, we have activism and social change. So, though having the very least number of activities, it still beams with bigger potential for future initiatives, especially that activism and social change advocacies are not easy to do. And we have, under this category, the fandoms channel their fundraising power towards initiative and sustainable and impactful outcomes for the future. For example, we have the Purple Walk of Love and the BTS Army Pearls fundraising. Next, we have. Okay, so let's take a look at the mapping of fandom-driven civic projects in the civic engagement continuum of Under and Goggin. As you can see, the activities conducted by Filipino BTS armies falls in the middle right, which somehow leads more to the collective action that involves a formal and public approach in their engagement. So there are also some that focus on community activities, and there are also very few political involvement. Particularly, I think some of us know that during the 2022 presidential election, where multiple K-pop fandoms, including the BTS armies, extended their full support for the former Vice President Leni Robredo as she ran for presidency that time. So, this formal, public, and community-focused collective action of BTS Army PH emphasizes the civic engagement in K-pop fandoms is already organized and deliberated and has the potential to go beyond individual acts of charity. And next we have, please, to explain the motivations behind fandom-driven civic engagement, we have here Sarah Margaret Gilgilin.
So here, we define their motivations in conducting these fandom-driven civic initiatives. So basically, the idols inspires them to be heard as encouraged by Kim Namjoon, also known as RM of BTS in the United Nations. Through civic initiatives, activities conducted within the fandom, 4 motivations arose from the thematic analysis of media text, the ARMY. So next please. First is the alignment to the advocacy. Filipino BTS armies conducted a number of their civic engagement activities under the umbrella of BTS 2-year partnership with UNICEF in 2017. One major example is their support for the Love Myself campaign, BTS's partnership with UNICEF promoting self-love, mental health awareness, and ending violence. Through charity events, mental health forums, and fundraising drives, as stated by Mela, that BTS influence extends beyond music empowering fandoms to become active agents of social change in their own communities. So next slide please. Replication of behaviors. BTS is known as generous donor, from donating to the Black Lives Matter movement to supporting children with hearing impairments receive music education. BTS sets an example that inspires fans to replicate these positive actions. As B. Rosales explains, being a BTS fan means more than just an admiration. It's about coming together as a community to make a real difference in the world. Next slide please. One unique civic engagement activity started as an indirect effect of behavior. RM was known as a plantito, a person who loves to take care of plants, and with that, BTS fans started a long-term environment project, the BTS Tree Park. A group of BTS fans kick-started a reforestation project in the mountains of Nueva Ecija, where over 1,000 trees were planted. As stated there, if BTS asked their fans to plant trees, then our problems with global warming will be solved. A quote that inspired Eliza Uy and company to start the project. Marked by celebration. It was during birthday season that most of the huge fundraising activities for various beneficiaries are conducted. A key quote from attorney Chita Herse stating that we have more reasons to give back considering the happiness the boys have brought to us. So examples of these initiatives are for RM and Jungkook's birthday, fans bought 2 metric tons of rice and sweet potatoes from farmers. Also, through the fandom's donation for J-Hope's birthday, they partnered with a telecommunications company to support the Hampag movement, a feeding initiative for people suffering from involuntary hunger, and was able to feed 100,000 Filipinos. Lastly, a big charitable activity was conducted by fans of BTS Jin to celebrate his birthday. They ceremonially turned over a 3.1 million pesos housing project for migrants and provided services for assistance for the National Center for Mental Health. Next, let's proceed to yield by creative works. The interaction between idols and fans transcends from encouraging self-reflection to rallying point of engagement and mobilization. We saw how creative works strengthen the fan engagement, so now we will move on to a donation drive for earthquake victims in Davao. It is located in the southern part of the Philippines, and it was inspired by a BTS song, Dulce, which talks about looking forward to better days. Next slide, please. So, the next one is BTS Fandom donated to Baliana.org, a non-profit organization that researches whales and dolphins. To continue the conservation and research on humpback whales, so the song was inspired, this song was called Whalian 52, and it's about a lonely whale.
Okay, so thank you, Marga. So in conclusion, fandom civic engagement exists, and it's the scope is very wild, very palpable, especially during the consequential times of our country. So it is really refused to be ignored. It's there, it exists. So they are doing formal public engagement and collective actions, which with activities ranging from charity to volunteerism and even delving more into sustainable causes. It answers all concerns the youth have during the moment of their disengagement by developing a mechanism to increase participation through a network of shared identity, understanding, and belongingness. So there's a question of sustainability, since the motivation is very much K-pop centric. However, there's no denying that K-pop and fandom culture can be a powerful tool for civic engagement and social mobilization in the Philippines.
Okay, so next slide, please. So there are certain challenges we have encountered during the creation of this study. So first, the major challenge we encounter is that data sources online are only temporarily available. So sometimes, because it's few years ago na, So we cannot find it anymore. As you can see the pictures, so articles are not available, these posts are not available. And also information regarding the civic engagement activities conducted by fandoms are too scattered across multiple platforms. Especially that not only that we have the shared platforms online, but the BTS armies have their very own platforms, which is the Weavers, the VLive, so we cannot dig deeper anymore. And next slide, please. So for further recommendation for the research, so we have conduct key informant interviews to triangulate the data with the quantitative data and documents gathered from this study. Also gather more information outside BTS fandom. So if some of you are wondering why we only chose BTS, so we are planning to expand more in the future. And develop a framework for conducting high-impact civic engagement activities tailored for fandoms. So this one is currently on work now because we are planning to create a framework for K-pop fandoms who are engaging with civic initiatives. Okay?
Pag may call po sila, fangirl daw po with a purpose, or fanboy with a purpose, turn passion into action. So thank you for listening para po sa kaunlaran. Salamat.
Thank you for again sharing to us, presenting to us that fandom-driven civic engagement. It's really fascinating to see how civic, how youth communities find meaningful ways to participate in nation building through pop culture, particularly Korean pop culture. I'm really curious on what are the risks or limitations do you guys or girls see on in relying on fandoms, for civic engagement instead of formal institutions. Perhaps you can answer that later. Alright, now let's move to our second presenter, who will explore the current state and possible future directions of K-pop industry through stakeholder lens. To present the paper titled "What's Next for Korean Pop Music: A Stakeholder Theory Perspective." Let's invite here Dr. Eric Paulo Capistrano from the
thank you for that. So my study, just for a little bit of an introduction, my study is a continuation of two papers that I presented last year. The first one was on innovation, and the second one was on corporate governance. So this is actually the third stab at having a management perspective in terms of Korean wave. And also for context, this is also a little bit fan-driven because I am a fan myself, and I kind of relate to this. So for this one will be more on a strategic management perspective regarding these fandoms. So next slide, please. So this is going to be our outline for today's presentation. Okay, next slide, please. So we first go to the introduction. So let's go K-pop for the numbers, especially like for the past couple of years, wherein we have something like so in 2022 we have album exports amounting to $231 million US. However, that being said, it's only 3% of the United States market share. So it's still pretty small, and despite the fact of what we've been saying regarding how big K-pop is, but unfortunately, in terms of the global perspective, it's a little bit small. Furthermore, this has been exacerbated in 2024. We're in. And so operating profits for the big four agencies, YG is actually down 94.5%. JYP is down another 79.6%. Hive is at 37.4%, and SM is at 30.7% decline in their operating profits. So that being said, there has been some concerns regarding how the industry has been growing, and the dilemma is now that some industry has leaders, specifically Bang Si-hyuk himself, has said that there are concerns that K-pop's popularity is actually waning. However, some are actually disagreeing with this sentiment. So that being said, there is still a need that needs to demonstrate that it can sustain its growth. And of course, one last thing will be favorable or unfavorable sentiments. Kind of depends on who you're talking to. So fans would say something like this, others would say something like this. So there is a need to kind of like have that collaboration or have that discussion, like who's making sense. So that being said, initially the two research objectives for this study are as follows. So to explain those differences in stakeholder sentiments and to develop strategic recommendations based on the future of the K-pop industry. So let's now proceed to the literature review. Just a quick background on the recent developments of K-pop, which would include some numbers. So according to Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism survey, there's an 85.7% consume content via online. And probably that goes for a lot of us. Like we watch YouTube videos, music videos, we listen to Spotify. If some of us are lucky enough or old enough to have Melon accounts, maybe naman ako. Okay, so yeah, some of us are all like so we will listen online to that. As opposed to, let's say, having a 19.1% who will purchase physical albums. Now, interestingly enough, Spotify has been a big they had a big role here. In 2024, Spotify paid royalties to South Korean artists amounting to $138 million, which is a 780% increase since 2017. That being said, here's where it gets a little bit confusing because if the numbers we show, and can you please? Yes, streaming's total revenue share is only like 13% for Hive, 10% for SM, and another 10% for JYP. So imagine, like, still, that being said, physical albums are still the biggest. Hive is reported like 2.5 times more of streaming. Now that of streaming, and JYP is another 4 times. So it's still. That being said, regarding that, despite the fact that there's a lot of noise online, physical albums still dominates sales for K-pop. However, so again, painting a confusing picture. First half of the year of 2024, it's reported that there were 44.7 million units sold, which is actually 16% down from the previous year. And then for the full year, 87.88 million, which is only 15%. Now that's okay. Now comparing it to 2023 numbers of $900 million there, streaming comprised 21%, physical albums another 31.4%, and live performances another 47.5%. So those are the numbers there. So again, we have a confusion wherein we have fans who consume a lot of content online, but then that doesn't really translate to an increase of the online-based consumption in terms of what is being reported as sales. So stakeholder theory is more. So I'm going to skip a little bit part of this. Just like this is the theory that I'm going to be using. It's really more about trying to advocate that there should be a balanced view regarding a balanced view on the different stakeholders that are involved with an industry. But for the purposes of today's research, I'll be limiting it to 3. And these are the customers or the fans, the producers, and the investors. So so let me skip that a little part. So basically, this is just an explanation of how the theory works, what the theory is trying to say. So now as you can see, there's the big four, okay? And this is where it also interestingly where it comes in, because stakeholder theory advocates that there should be like a more quote-unquote balanced view of the industry. However, these big four, HYBE, YG, JYP, and SM, they're the ones who actually dominate the industry. And not only on the production side, but also in terms of this is phenomenon about fandoms wherein there are company stands. Okay? Wherein like even fans themselves are a fan not only of a group but also of a company. And unfortunately, there's a growing number of them that don't care about others. So like for example, I'm a fan of SM Entertainment groups. Okay, and so I really don't care so much about JYP or YG groups or HYBE groups. Yeah? So there's that kind of phenomenon that is going on these days. Also in terms of the distribution, because for example, Spotify for example, and you has a partnership with Kakao Music, which is dominating then in terms of the distribution of music online, and also for the international fans. YouTube is a main source of consumption for the music videos. So, okay. So going on to the methods, I'm gonna do an evaluation of these different stakeholders. So for one, okay, for the fans, we have different demands and interests, and are critical to the K-pop industry. And of course, we know that there's like millions of fans across the world, and more than like 110 countries. And many of the fans' online traffic numbers are perceived as indicators of said popularity. However, and probably like present day K-pop fans, you kind of notice there that this is not a homogeneous group, and a lot of the clash between fandoms would be from the point of view older fans, younger fans, or like non-Koreans and Koreans. So that's where it gets a little bit muddy. Fans generate a lot of value, but in many different ways. There are direct and indirect ways in which they can create this value. On the other hand, okay, we have the production companies. We're gonna see something like again, as I mentioned, the agencies which comprise like 85% of costs to produce K-pop content. And of course, that being said, they do have a very significant say of how the industry would go. Now, this is what we're seeing here. That some will say that that this is waning, but the other ones that say they're not. Now, here's where it gets interesting in terms of the investor side. Because on the investor side, or meaning the shareholders themselves, okay, they see something different. What do I mean? Music streaming, for instance, music streaming growth has been touted as one of the biggest in terms of its growth. It's like 180% since 2018 for the US, 420% for Southeast Asia, and 360% worldwide. And they account for 62% of global album sales. However, as investors, one of the biggest indicators there is the share price. Share prices are actually down. So that's the curious part. Okay. There's an unprecedented growth in sales, especially online sales. However, investor sentiments are different. They're not really confident about the sustainability of this growth as reflected in the movement of these share prices. So they made an average growth of 75% in 2023. However, when it comes to 2024, they're all down. Although nakabawi din in 2025. Okay, so but still, net, they're still down compared to a few years ago. So that being said, so these movements imply that investor and industry sentiments do not necessarily resonate completely with the number of fans. So that's all. What can we conclude so far from this? So for this, and let me flash all of these strengths and weaknesses. So these are the different strengths and weaknesses of the fans. Yeah, they're very loyal, they're very vocal. However, we have a tendency to be impulsive and rapid online. So, yeah, that's what. And it's difficult to ascertain if we have expert opinions of this. Case in point, a couple of weeks ago, Taeyeon's concert in Japan was cancelled. And then a lot of fans were already clamoring that she leaves SM Entertainment. Okay. However, given Taeyeon's caliber, which agency can actually match her vocal prowess should she leave SM Entertainment? And so that's the problem, because SM Entertainment's production capacities can still match Taeyeon's vocal capabilities. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any company that can match that one. So that's one thing. Fans can be very impulsive with their feedback, but they're not seeing a follow through of those sentiments. For companies, on the other hand, yes, they do have the production prowess for it, but they rarely listen to the fans. Yeah, that's the other thing. So they still have a lot. Like, for example, just earlier today, I was looking through Twitter. It was only now that SM Entertainment apologized for the cancellation of Taeyeon's concert in Japan. Napaghahalatan po ko ng fandom po talaga ako. Okay? Because of it. Excuse me. And then for the investors or the shareholders, now this is something that's also very tricky. Yeah, they do have the money for it. They do have the money for it. They do have the resources for it. But this is also like one of the biggest concerns when it comes to corporate governance. Because, for example, like historically, like prior to SM Entertainment changing ownership, Lee Soo-man owned 19% of SM Entertainment, and he's also a producer. So meaning he's both an owner and a manager, which in traditional management theory is something that's very tricky. And we have what we call an agency problem there. Same with HYBE. Like Bang Si-hyuk owns 31% of HYBE. Park Jin-young owns 15% of JYP. And then Yang Yoon-sok owns 19.33% of YG. And these are the biggest single shareholders in the company. And yet they're also operating in management. So there's a control problem there. Yes, they have the resources. Yes, they have the creative direction. But also, as we've seen through the decades of these agencies, it has presented a lot of problems, a lot of issues with the talent and with the fans. So that being said, we can see that all of them, in terms of impact, customers have all of them will have high impact in terms of how the direction of K-pop's future can have. But in terms of the influence, despite the noise, fans actually, let's be honest, regardless of how much we try to trend something on Twitter or in social media, it's very rare that companies and investors would listen to us. Okay, so that's the biggest problem. So influence is low for fans, and therefore, in terms of companies and investors, it's also very high. Now, caveats. So, like I said, it doesn't cost them much to stream for fans. Okay? All we need is a good internet connection. We can spam stream as much as we want. However, for everything else, it's very costly. Okay? For everything else, very costly. I myself have been clamoring, for foreign promoters, don't rely on streaming numbers to decide whether to bring an artist here or not. Yeah, it just costs nothing, but then can they shell out 12,000 pesos for a VIP seat in a concert? You can't. Physical albums, merchandise, and live events still make more money for the companies. And fans are very active in social media, but companies will still have final say on things. For investors, they get to decide on key management issues, yes, but they're also a lot like hit or miss. And for companies, many executives tend to overreach and make questionable decisions. So, and then of course other issues, media. Media can be a confounding event on that one. The problem with media is that yes, they are very influential, but at the same time, they can steer public opinion. And so that's the thing. And of course, when we go international, there will be a lot of regulatory requirements and cultural differences that should be managed for this. So, in conclusion, so what's next for K-pop? So what's next for K-pop? For K-pop's competitiveness to continue, these are the different things that we should look into. Yeah, continue to set sights on Southeast Asian market because it's geographically nearer, does make sense. It must better take care of their idle trainees and develop a more advanced system to incubate them. This has been an issue in the sense that a lot of the younger K-pop groups have been subject to a lot of criticisms regarding cultural misappropriation, the cultural sensitivities and whatnot. So, and that's attributed to the shorter training times that they had post 2010. What did happen in 2010? What happened in 2010? You need to talk to me later na lang. So, wala tayong oras. Alright. Then for the last part, for it to be sustainable, the issues on minority shareholders and stakeholders, as exemplified what happened in SM Entertainment 2 years ago, prior to the shift in ownership, is a highlight there. But also, like fostering strategic alliances, establishing new label system to nurture diverse training talents, developing new metrics, and all these other things is something that we need to think about. Now, contrary to what some would think about, it's not waning. At least as far as my own opinion goes, it's not waning, but maybe slowly plateauing. It's still limited to a few popular groups, but in fact, like K-pop has a very rich, diverse pool of content, and so maybe we need to dive further into it. Song styles and concepts can be revisited and reinvented. Maybe some renaissance is needed there, and the need to develop and implement strong corporate governance and mechanisms. And then for next steps, so obviously what I've shown to you is I've limited just to 3 stakeholders. So these are the next steps for this one: deeper scrutiny to examine gaps between the actual company performance and investor sentiments, which means that despite record-breaking performances, share prices are very volatile. Like why? And then of course deeper investigation and credibility of fans vis-a-vis they're being vocal about the actors and the companies, that should be made, and when to listen to and when not to listen to fans as far as that's concerned, and obviously investigation on the effects of poor corporate governance structures plaguing K-pop companies. So these are so at the end of it all, we need to see that this is something that needs to be improved on, and if we want to have a better picture of what's next for K-pop. Okay. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Eric, for that thorough and thought-provoking analysis. I think the multi-stakeholder perspective definitely helps us see K-pop as not just a cultural wave, but also a complex global industry. At the beginning, I thought the reason why the K-pop is plateauing based on the assumption is that it's more on market saturation and creative fatigue. So I think the presentation of Dr. Eric presents more than that. So I'm excited to also hear your comments and questions later. Now, rounding out the session 8 is a paper by John Marvin Go of the University of Santo Tomas titled Gothicizing Han Squid Game as a Site of Korean Gothic Imaginary. His paper will examine how Squid Game reflects Korean culture, cultural trauma, and capitalist critique through a Gothic lens. Friends, let's welcome Mr. John Marvin Go.
Yeah, that mic check. Good afternoon. So I will be approaching this particular reading using a humanistic lens. So aside from the kind of usual readings that we have that talks about it being a capitalist enterprise and capitalist readings that try to utilize Netflix as a platform, my reading would be a kind of different. So I think that Squid Game needs a further introduction, especially for our Gen Z and our millennials here. But for the sake of this conference, of course, I will be presenting some sort of introduction. And slide number 2. My presentation is about Squid Game, a South Korean survival drama series. First appeared on Netflix on September 17, 2021. Its release marked a watershed moment for global streaming culture. In the span of just 28 days, the series amassed 111 million viewers, an unprecedented achievement and amount of viewers that positioned it as Netflix's most watched series at the time. The narrative of Squid Game unfolds around individuals suffering from extreme economic distress who are lured into participating in a deadly series of children's games with the promise of a life-altering cash prize. By 2024, Squid Game maintained its dominance in global viewership. The release of Squid Game Season 2 confirmed its continued relevance by achieving the #1 spot on Netflix across 73 countries, including the Philippines, which underpins its pervasive transcultural impact. Critics have also frequently classified Squid Game as a horror series, given its disturbing violence and the unsettling psychological experience it imposed on both characters and audiences. As a non-Korean Filipino presenter, I remain aware of the complexities that arise when engaging with the concept of Han, an emotion that emerges from South Korea's historical and cultural experience. Professor Michael Lushin of Korean Research Society, in his 2019 lecture on Lure, captured this tension by stating, and I quote, "Even Koreans cannot explain it in another language, but they can point it out when they see it." So perhaps this would be the most appropriate venue for this kind of discussion. And Han resists easy translation. It is something recognized, not simply defined. This elusiveness shapes my positionality as a Filipino researcher, although Professor Shin expressed hope, and I quote, that Han can be understood by non-Koreans. I have been motivated to examine whether such understanding is fully possible. In particular, I consider whether Squid Game can function as a cultural artifact that brings the textures of Han closer from my subjectivity and framing. While much of the analysis has focused on its critique of economic inequality, there is a conspicuous absence of inquiry into the potential of Squid Game to be understood through the lens of Han, a concept tied to historical injustice and unresolved suffering. Moreover, the potential to quote-unquote gothicize Squid Game has not been fully explored, especially in terms of how its narrative and visual elements evoke a sense of dread, ontological insecurity, and bodily anxiety. Therefore, my analysis attempts to show how Squid Game draws on both Han and Gothic affect, adding another layer to its critique of capitalism while enhancing its horrifying emotional and cinematic impact, and by extension, of course, possibly configure the entanglements of Han to Gothic affects. Through a close cinematic reading of selected sequences from Squid Game, the inquiry will demonstrate that the series materially and cinematically enacts Han through its recursive temporalities of loss, its effective saturation of space, and its rendering of suffering as an unfinished, irresolvable condition. The second question, I think, demands the formulation of a critical framework that draws from Gothic affect, which positions the Gothic not through aesthetic markers, but through the modulation of bodily and psychic insecurity. The project, therefore, will not simply graft Gothic fruits into Squid Games, but will attempt to configure a notion of quote-unquote Gothic Han, a hybridized affective mode where historical grievance and Gothic dread converge. Next slide, please. Han, according to the analysis of Bjorn Bowman and Sandra Sochi Kim, is best understood as a deep historical and emotional structure of unresolved suffering. It is not merely sadness, nor anger, nor frustration, but the layered feeling that emerges when individuals and communities endure injustice, experience oppression, and find available pathways for redress or healing. Over time, Han has evolved to represent the accumulated sorrow of South Korean collective history, marked by colonization, war, poverty, division, and political violence, where each episode of trauma deepens its presence within the national and the historic consciousness. However, Han is not an ancient natural essence embedded biologically within Korean identity. Of course, Kim argues that the racialization of Han is portrayed as a sorrow, quote-unquote, running in the blood of Koreans, was fabricated during the Japanese colonial period as part of a larger strategy to essentialize and infantilize South Korean under empire. Today, critical scholarship challenges these essentialist views, and I argue that particular research like Kim 2017 and Bowman 2020 both affirm that Han should be understood as historical affect generated by real, material experiences of oppression rather than by biological inheritance. Drawing from scholars like Chong Tae-yeon, Yelin Nam describes Han as an affect that persists independently of any specific cause, comparable to a bodily ache that remains even when its original injury is forgotten. Chon Lidu further complicates the concept by insisting that Han contains both negativity and transcendence nested within it, which only suggests that Han is never purely destructive because it harbors both the scourge and the potential for aesthetic and psychic renewal. Squid Game can be read through the lens of Han by examining how the player's suffering reflects on the collective trauma. The participants' entrapment in the games mirrors how individuals and communities experience enduring cyclical suffering with no escape, at least as we know it until season 2. The series also emphasizes Han by transforming unresolved grief into a monstrous and haunting force. So HGQ further describes Han as potentially becoming, and I quote, a people-eating monster. And in Squid Game, this transformation occurs through the show's cinematic language. Han, in the sense, becomes a spectral and haunting presence that turns personal suffering into a horrifying, uncanny experience, which aligns with the Gothic's exploration of repressed histories, emotional entrapment, and societal collapse excitements. In Gothic Affect, an alternative approach to critical models of the contemporary Gothic savior, Aldana Reyes repositions affect at the center of Gothic operations by rejecting traditional aesthetic thematic frameworks that he argues obscure the genre's primary function to produce destabilizing bodily experiences. Diagnosing a critical impasse, Reyes contends that Gothic text should not be identified through imagery such as castles or vampires or zombies, but through the somatic and emotional disturbances they intend to provoke. Reyes theorizes Gothic affect as a machinic operation that induces fear, dread, and ontological insecurity irrespective of conventional motif. This particular reorientation displaces aesthetic surface like the use of zombies, castles, and vampires as the criteria for classification and instead foregrounds experiential disturbance, especially for our audiences, that allows contemporary horror, dystopia, and social critique narratives to enter the field of Gothic inquiry if they operate through affective threat. Gothic, therefore, for Reyes is not what is seen, but what is suffered. A force that renders the subject precarious through narrative and sensory anxieties. To answer the first question, Squid Game does not simply depict Han, but actively gothicizes it by transforming Han into hunting. So there's Han and hunting, an effective force that pervades the characters' lives. In this sense, Squid Game creates a world where Han is not just emotion, but rather an inescapable condition that continually reenacts the unresolved trauma of systemic oppression, and in doing so, intensifying the series' critique of capitalist exploitation. So for event number 1, the gothicization of suffering in play, in Ganbo Season 1, Episode 6, Gi-hun's betrayal of Il-nam produces a critical aperture through which Han becomes cinematically legible as a violent psychic rupture rather than a static emotional residue. The forced antagonism between partners within the fatal logic of the marble game positions survival as contingent upon betrayal, thereby collapsing relational ethics into pure contingency. Gihon's deception of Ilnam does not proceed from individual malice but emerges from historical affectivity, a structure in which betrayal and guilt are sedimented, microcosmic responses to systemic abandonment. What unfolds is not simply a personal failure, but an inscription of Han as an unsolved compulsion where historical grievances are condensed into immediate bodily action presented on screen by our actors. The visual composition of the scenes refracts Han into a Gothic affect. The spatial arrangement, recalling a sanitized version of a childhood alley, produces an uncanny dissonance. The familiar is rendered hostile. The nostalgic becomes the site of mortal violence. The scene's utilization of sunset yellow, devoid of warmth, imposes a harsh visibility that evacuates comfort and intensifies exposure. Close-up shots disaggregate Gihon's face into fragmented expressions, while low-key shadows intermittently fissure his features, which materializing the instability of his moral and emotional state. Gihon's betrayal stages not only the collapse of personal loyalty, but the disintegration of relational meaning under historical violence. In this moment, Han does not remain melancholic. It mutates into a force of psychic horror that entangles affecting life with existential collapse as amplified by the juxtaposed events from other participants that are happening at the same time. Squid Game through this visual and temporal orchestration does not narrate Han. It goticizes it by staging the horror of being unable to disentangle personal guilt from historical violence, self from betrayal, survival from mourning. Next slide, please. Setting number 1. Spaces of Gothic entrapment and infantilized violence. The interiors of the game venue, revealed before the players are even led to the red light, green light arena in Season 1, Episode 1, establish the foundational tone of disorientation and emotional distortion. The walls painted in overexposed pastels, mint green staircases, baby pink walls, pale yellow doors, simulate a palette associated with safety and childhood comfort, yet the oversaturation and the artificial quality of the colors displays the audience's emotional expectations. What should console instead unsettles. The passive excess drains these spaces of their warmth by converting them into corridors of pending violence. The players, dressed uniformly in dull green tracksuits, move within its maze-like architecture, their individuality erased even before the games begin. The manipulation of color saturates the space with an eerie sterility by staging Han not as explosive emotionality, but as a quiet corrosion of the psyche, thereby producing a flattened affect that anticipates collapse. Upon entering the first game arena, the visual logic established earlier is grotesquely amplified. A vast playground stretches into an unnerving horizon, painted in artificial blue skies and plastic trees. The high-angle wide shots expose the players as miniaturized figures against this infantilized landscape, their human vulnerability magnified by the sheer size of the structures. Here, Gothic affect takes hold precisely through spatial and visual contradiction. The child's world is reconfigured as a death field. Innocence, rather than being preserved, becomes weaponized. The enormous animatronic doll, centrally positioned, governs life and death, with mechanized precision and secures any lingering association between child's play and safety. Through this spatial absurdity, Han is rendered as a tangible force, not merely the sorrow of a lost past, but a violent distortion of memory itself. The players, products of economic abandonment, find themselves reenacting a grotesque mimicry of play, forced into a stage where survival negates innocence. The goticization of Han, therefore, materializes through the collapse of protective environments. The players' economic despair, which already inscribed them with Han before their arrival, becomes visually externalized through the environment's betrayal of cinematic expectation. Next slide, please. And in Squid Game's 7th episode, VIPs, the elite's extravagance domain sharply contrasts with the brutal spaces where the contestants face life or death struggles. The VIPs, hidden behind animal masks, reside in lavish setting of red carpets, gold chandeliers, and ornate furniture. This opulent environment is divorced from the violence of the games, yet its decadence intensifies the moral decay that defines this particular episode. The lighting, dim and shadowy, obscures details and amplifies secrecy and menace that pervades the VIP's presence. Their animal masks transform the VIPs into grotesque, predatory figures unmoored from human identity. Cinematically, the VIPs are framed in grand isolated shots, while the contestants are depicted as smaller, vulnerable figures, often in high-angle shots and always monitored through a large television screen. This visual contrast highlights the grotesque power dynamics at play, where the VIPs' detached cruelty is mirrored in their privileged positioning. The space, rich with excess yet morally hollow, becomes a site where the luxurious and the disturbing intersect, just like what Han is being configured initially. The anonymity of the mask coupled with the lavish wealth disguises the cold indifference of the elite toward human suffering. In this context, Han emerges as a bodily, emotional state that is not only personal but also collective and is rooted within systemic exploitation. The rich setting and the VIP's masked anonymity transform this into a Gothic space where the tension between wealth and cruelty is realized through the suffering of the players. To answer the second question, next slide please. The demand for a critical framework based on Reyes' concept of Gothic affect necessitates a reframing of both Gothic aesthetics and Squid Game. The aim must not be to map Gothic iconography onto the series, but to interrogate how Squid Game functions as an alternative affective apparatus that disrupts the viewer's psychic and somatic coherence. Reyes' shift from representational imagery to affective disturbance compels the critic to focus not on what Squid Game depicts, but on the affect it generates. Here, Squid Game is not merely a text that uses Gothic elements, instead it operates as a site where Gothic affect is activated through the show's cinematic decisions. Through this theoretical reorientation, I propose quote-unquote Gothic Han as a hybridized affective mode, where historical grievance or Han and the existential horror Gothic affect co-constitute each other. In Squid Game, Han is not merely an emotional residue, but an active embodied experience of unresolved trauma. The character's psychological and physical disintegration, combined with their narrative unraveling, materializes Han not as a theme, but as an effective event. The labyrinthine dormitories, sterile arenas, and voyeuristic control rooms function as topologies of suspension, or spaces where survival and death, agency and entrapment, individuality and systemic consumption merge and produces an inescapable liminal space and place that Gi-hun finds himself chained into returning in Season 2 despite winning in the first season. Ultimately, Squid Game is not simply a Gothic allegory or narrative, but a machine that amplifies and distorts Han within a Gothic affective economy. It stages a traumatic temporality in which historical violence, economic despair, and existential dread do not resolve but circulate endlessly and contaminate both characters and spectators in the process. And for the conclusion, last slide please. Configuring the quote-unquote South Korean Gothic imaginary. Through Squid Game, we find a tentative model for exploring the South Korean Gothic, particularly through the concept of Han. This series does not really depict Han, it Gothicizes it by rendering it as a persistent, inescapable presence within both the narrative and the viewer's emotional experiences. Han, therefore, as a rooted cultural and emotional force, converges with the Gothic by transforming human monstrosity into a structural condition rather than an individual affliction. This disorienting spaces of the game, the characters' betrayals, and the overwhelming violence that unfolds all contribute to Han's materialization as an effective force. This Gothicized element suggests a haunting that shape the character's actions and by extension, the show's critique of capitalism. The South Korean Gothic as a mode therefore does not really represent a haunted event, but also materializes hauntings as lived, affective conditions. It renders visible and sensible the impossibility of healing, the foreclosure of futurity, and the collapse of moral coherence under the weight of historical and economic violence. It is a Gothic without ghost, yet saturated with hauntings. A Gothic without castles, yet filled with clean prisons. A Gothic without redemption, yet thick with a desire for historical, societal, and economic liberation. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, John Marvin, for the razor sharp analysis. Curious how many times did you watch the series? Like, could we ever actually pull off shake, rattle, and roll kind of level of effective disruption as you mentioned? No? So can we have that goticizing Coco Martin's Ang Provinciano? Alright, now I think you were ready to accommodate questions, entertain some inquiries, clarifications, comments from our member of the audience. We invite first our presenters here. Medyo madami tayo, no? Can we give them a round of applause, please? I'll follow the same mechanics as Professor Jean. No? I'll accommodate first 3 questions, and then altogether our presenters will address or answer your questions. Anyone? Sure.
No problem. Actually, we have several questions, but I'll start with Sir Eric for now. Because you mentioned some of the stakeholders, so including the fans and the investors, but I think K-pop industry can also be considered as a sort of art market, wherein the genre itself is being sold, and the product itself, like the music and stuff like that, can go through the trends of art as well, and be outdated or shifting preferences among the what do you call it, the patrons, kumbaga. So if you were to include brokers, for example, like when Korean artists are chosen by certain big fashion brands to represent, diba? So parang they're kind of being brokered na, okay, this person, we think it's cool, or this genre, we think it's cool, so let us adopt that and to market our product, so, or to sell as a product, as a sort of art. So maybe, that's what the question is, like, if the brokers were to be considered as stakeholders, what would be their position in the development of K-pop in the future?
Yeah. Later, this is right. Huh? We'll collect first questions.
I also have a lot of questions in mind. However, this question will be towards Sir Eric po muna. It was a very interesting study. While presenting, naisip ko rin po kasi, did you take the companies buying their own? Di ba may mga ibang statistics or news that there are companies who buys their own artists' albums. Have you ever taken this into account, or have you delved deeper into this issue people, when you have this research in mind? Yeah.
Okay. 2 questions for Sir Eric. Yeah. Sir, go first.
My question is directed to the 3 ladies in front. I kind of remember that I kind of did a paper similar to BTS, and it's a very interesting, and it's very seldom that you get to see, because when you talk about fandom, normally it's always, pejorative. We always think of them as negative. Now, just to balance the argument, the argument, because you mentioned about the good things about when you join in BTS, right, and other fandoms later on. Just to balance the argument, what about let's flip it. What are the downsides of joining BTS army? Because if I remember it correctly, sometimes it's very polarizing, right? Like when you're a fan of BTS, at some point, normally you're already an enemy of Blackpink, because at some point I think that reached that kind of polarization in fandom, right? So maybe just the counter argument of it, just to balance it, the antithesis of it. So that's my question.
We'll ask first Dr. Eric to answer the 2 questions, and then after that, ladies from the West Visayas.
Alright, yeah. For the first question on, let's say, brands, like other brands being like brokers and their decision for it. Yes, but this is more like packaging the idols like a brand extension. Because there are moves wherein like the artist, the company kind of like repackages the artist to be more than just a singer or a dancer. It becomes an act. Because what I've also observed through the years was that before, like early to mid 2000s until 2010s, you need to build up the artist first before he or she becomes a credible brand endorser. Okay. But then later on, but then on the other hand, you have like a group like Blackpink, wherein they only have a few songs and yet they're giants when it comes to being global brand ambassadors. So the message there is that they're being packaged more. They're being packaged more as a whole entertainer rather than just being a singer or a dancer. So the reading there is that the artist is become the name of the artist. In this case, like say Blackpink, right? Lisa or Jennie or Jisoo or Rosé. They're more than just an art. They're more than just a singer, but more like a cultural icon. And so that's how it's being. Unfortunately, especially for Lisa, this is becoming a little bit detrimental because the rumors of her being allegedly the boyfriend of Arnold, right, is being a little bit detrimental. So parang there's a scaling back to it na. There's a scaling back to it na. But then it's again they're being packaged more like the name itself is a brand extension rather than just it being limited to a singer or a dancer. So that's the, let's say, the stake or like how these brands dictate in their choices, of these artists being part of being chosen to be brand ambassadors. Now, for the question on that one, the problem kasi is there's nothing that I couldn't find anything to substantiate those accusations in terms of that. But yes, of course there are. But also we need to further scrutinize when it comes to physical album sales. We're not just in it for the albums. We're not just in it for the CDs. No, we're in it for the photo books. Okay, and may mga 2,000 ganyan. But also the thing is that it's all part of the marketing gimmick. You buy the album, you buy the physical album, not just for the CD, but also for all of the other things that come with it. Photo cards, the photo books, and whatnot. And it actually creates an underground economy as wherein like some fans would buy 2 or 3 copies. Okay. They'll keep one, they'll open one, they'll keep the other 2 sealed in the hopes that later on they can sell it online. So that's a secondary market. There's a secondary market to it, and I haven't really gone that deep yet. Yes, it is an interesting phenomenon. Why? May kumakagat. So that's the thing. And then of course there's another phenomenon wherein as a marketing gimmick, right? Fans would buy multiple albums in the hope that they will get into a fan signing event. Right? So that's the other thing. So, but if you notice, a lot of the fans who actually do this are the big fan sites. Like say in our fandom, that's usually Kim Tae Ba. So that's the thing. And even with us, because like before we had an instance where we wanted to do group buying of Forever One. The album. But so we had a deal with our Korean partners there. They're gonna bulk buy albums for us, but they'll keep the raffle for the fan signing. So there's an entire underground organized economy there. And the degree of organization, I haven't really gone into it yet. Yeah, but it's something that, definitely down the road, it's something to look forward to.
The next question is for Giselle, Ian, and Margaret.
Hello, good afternoon. For the negative effects of fandom, especially with the fan wars and single stand. I think Lian can answer that for us.
Akala mo i-introhan. Okay, so let me introduce myself. I've been in army for more than a decade na din, since 2014. So I've been through a lot of fun wars when I was a baby army pa. So I think it's a very toxic mindset of the fans. But we cannot generalize everyone. There are different perspectives inside the fan base. So there are armies who likes to do fun wars. There are armies who, or let's say not just armies. So there are fans who like to do fun wars. There are fans who does not like fun wars and see the perspective of a male K-pop idol and a female K-pop idol as a friendship connection rather than a secret relationship. But I think this kind of toxic mindsets that fans have is a very big disadvantage, especially to new members of the fan base who just entered, because it can influence their own beliefs as well if they will not dig deeper into what's behind that. So that's for me.
In terms of civic engagement, we'll still put it in the context of the research. Actually, one of the theories that we use is social interdependence theory. So this research is actually just one part of it, the positive social interdependence part of the theory, because it's catering to one fandom. But if we did analyze other fandoms or also conducting civic engagement, that also have like a negative social interdependence. But what happens is the tendency, if, for example, I don't want to create anything, but for example, armies versus XOLs. Doing, to those who can understand, yes. So, doing, for example, civic engagement, armies will be doing civic engagement, that's the positive social interdependence. But when XOLs do something good for the society, your armies will elevate their efforts. Because that's the negative social interdependence. There's like gamifying the civic engagement space. So I think that's going to be the interesting part of it. That's going to be the interesting arena for the next part of the research. So maybe competition, especially in the context of civic engagement, is good. For the society, maybe bad for the mental health of our children. But yeah, I agree. It's a very small part of the fandom. The fan wars. Agree? All the fandoms here, yes. Thank you very much.
Alright. In the interest of time, I can only accommodate one more question. Oh my gosh, ang dami pa. Patay. Can you accommodate at least two? Okay, sige. Pero sino na una? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So my question is for Mr. Chan Martinico. So I'm currently developing a paper on SPICA, media analysis, and tied with philosophy. So as mentioned in your introduction, the concept of Han is not only a unique blend of sorrow, resentment, and injustice. There is also a possibility for transcendence. So you mentioned that in the introduction. So that mention of transcendence reminded me of a scene. I'm not sure which episode was it, but I'm sure it's not in season 2. So there's a scene where they showed in-house room, and then there are books there, the small desk, then books, then 2 of the books there that caught my attention was first The Stranger by Albert Camus, which tackles the absurdity of existence and indifference of society, and then the second book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. So, which delves into overcoming, transcending societal norms, collective values, and imposed systems. So in my preliminary analysis for the work that I'm doing, in my analysis, Inho is trying to release or process his hand through these books that he is reading, trying to make sense of his own, suffering, right? But if you read through these books, instead of transcending these viscerally negative conditions, states of mind, instead of processing and releasing that deep-seated trauma, in Inho's case, it boosted it. So I'm just curious, what happens now to that potential of Han to be transcended, to be released? Or is the transcendence, just moving past it, but it's neither positive nor negative?
Okay, so to respond in terms of the configuration of transcendence, I think they're only using it as some sort of marker. Whether you're able to transcend or unable to transcend, at least it's under the criterion of the transcendence. So in that respect, I think even though our characters were trying to bypass the system by sublimating it through reading those books that you mentioned, I think we could not really escape that kind of game, at least until season 2, because the story is yet incomplete. Number 2, I think in terms of the way how their narrative goes, especially Inho's narrative, I don't think that there's a kind of explicit attempt to kind of sublimate that kind of actions to transcend this particular economic system and the actual economy of the game itself. So therefore, when we're trying to locate it into the cinematic analysis, there might be some sort of limited number of frames that we can utilize. But in terms of the narrative and philosophicality of it, I think that's a great gap that we are able to pursue. So Bob, you are on the correct track.
One more question. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, hi, I'm Ray from the Education Center. I'm sorry I wasn't able to attend the first part, but I really was particularly excited for it, Sarah, because I am also an RD. And I also do researches on civic engagement. So, actually, more than a question, I was also going to recommend, if you want to look into fan-based citizenship as a concept, it's a relatively new concept. I think 2019, I can share references later. But really, it takes a look more into how these K-pop fans become more affiliated with the fandom more than like a national citizenship. Like for example, in K-pop stands for the last elections, K-pop stands were more affiliated as K-pop fans. Like we are doing this because we are K-pop fans and we want this candidate more than I am a Filipino. That's why I'm making my decision. Blah, blah, blah. So it might be an interesting concept also to look at, also because I wanted to do my thesis on it. And then also to answer your question, Mr. Kanina, because I also got that question from my professors, like, why are you focusing on the good side now? Yeah. Well, part of the research also is, the reason why we also look into BTS is because we also want to elevate and like, I guess formalize and like institutionalize them in the academy, because back in 2020 when I also wanted to submit a thesis on BTS, my professor who was in Korea was also saying that, oh, it's gonna be hard because the academy doesn't really, it does not legitimize yet in the academy, so it's great. But downsides of the fandom, to add to the fan wars, because I also have my own gripe. Right now, I think it's hard getting into the fandom because it's already really big. Yeah. So the fan culture that we have institutionalized back then, it's kind of hard transferring it, especially since a lot of people got into K-pop during the pandemic. It's a whole other conversation how people who found fandoms weird became into fandoms, and it changed how fandoms work. Like right now, fanfics are icky, but like fanfics were part of the institutions of the fandoms. See, that meanings. But so there's that, and then since we are looking at a community that's online and not physically bound by a geographical location, it's now we are slaves to the algorithm. So before it was easier to mobilize on Twitter, on any other social media platform, but now it's harder. So one in an RP I think had a difficulty raising funds na rin. There are a lot of dissenting opinions now that the algorithm doesn't really help with. So it's hard working together as a fandom now versus before. But question,
now that I'm done with my chica. How do you think can we continue with civic engagements as a fandom? Because as mentioned earlier, like it really dies down at some point. Like not all of us are like di naman tayo full-time fans. We also have our own jobs, we have our own studies. So how do you think can we continue encouraging other fans or other fandoms to stay active in the civic space? Because we are making a change. It's just that we have to be more consistent and sustainable with it. Thank you.
Right. Perhaps, ladies, you can briefly answer or address it.
Okay. Yes. So well, fandom is just one thing. It's just it's so big now, but it's just one thing that we can join in order to be civic engage. We can engage in our communities. So that's why I think we started this with fandom-driven civic engagement, BTS, fandom civic engagement, to eventually we learned that there's specific interest groups, especially with the youth. It's more on interest-driven rather than a structure that's existing. So, the question will be sustainability for this. It's still similar with your structured institutions. It will die down eventually. I don't want to name names of your formal institutions, but when engaging with youth, you need to look into what they are doing instead of what they are not. So if they're not engaging, there's something wrong with the system, so we need to tweak it. It doesn't need to be fandom. It has to be something that they're interested in. So I know it's corny, but find the heart of the youth where we can tap them to be civic, to re-engage them in our civic actions. I know it's corny, but that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to our presenters for challenging our, or rethinking our K-pop culture, no? Not just as escapism, as Basher would say, but also a vibrant field of civic action, industry strategies, and cultural critique. Now, to formally recognize the contribution of our presenters, I present this certificate of appreciation. Let me read the citation. UP Korea Research Center Certificate of Appreciation. The certificate is proudly presented to Giselle Marie D. Aranas for presenting their paper entitled From Stands to Active Citizenships or Citizens, Spaces, Motivations for Civic Engagement in K-pop Fandoms in the Philippines at 2025 10th Philippine Korean Studies Symposium, a decade of Korean studies in the Philippines, a glance at the past, gains at the present, a glimpse of the future held at the University of the Philippines, Quezon City, Philippines, awarded on the 29th of April 2025. Signed, Kyungin Bae, PhD, Director of UP Korean Research Center. The same citation is also awarded to Lian Marie Española. And also Sarah Margaret Gavina. Next is a paper titled What's Next for Korean Pop Music, a Stakeholder Theory Perspective, presented to or awarded to Eric Paulo Escapistrano, PhD.
Actually, word ko nga po, but I'll write my UP email na lang din.
And last, but definitely not the list, the certificate is presented and awarded to John Marvin Ago for presenting his paper titled Doggy Size in Hand, Squid Game as a Site of Korean Gothic Imaginary. And that concludes our session 8. We now directly proceed to our last session this afternoon.